New beginnings in Maplewood. Elaine and Thomas Wilson drove slowly through the picturesque streets of Maplewood, their car's windows rolled down to let in the warm summer breeze. The quaint suburban town looked like something out of a postcard, with its tree-lined avenues, charming homes, and the occasional American flag waving from a porch. As they pulled up to their new house, a beautiful white-walled colonial with a sprawling front yard, Elaine couldn't help but smile. "It's perfect, Thomas," she said, gripping her husband's hand. "This place, this house, it's exactly what we needed." Thomas returned her smile, giving her hand a gentle squeeze. "I think you're right. It feels like a fresh start." At 35, Thomas carried himself with an air of quiet authority, the kind that came from his background in law enforcement, though he was keeping his new position a secret for now. The town council had asked him not to mention his role as the incoming police chief until the official announcement next month. Unloading their belongings and arranging their new home took up most of the morning. By early afternoon, Elaine had already imagined how she'd decorate each room, even envisioning herself grading papers in the cozy bay window. A high school English teacher by profession, Elaine was excited to start at Maplewood High in the fall, where she hoped to connect with the students and build her classroom into a safe and inspiring space. Thomas, on the other hand, had been quietly observing the town. He noticed how certain neighborhoods felt hushed whenever a police car passed by. He observed the way the black residents avoided eye contact with officers, and how they seemed to go about their business with an anxious haste that wasn't as obvious among the town's white residents. Just as they were starting to unpack the kitchen, they were interrupted by a friendly knock on the door. Opening it, they were greeted by their new neighbor, Martha, a white-haired, elderly woman with a warm smile. "Welcome to Maplewood," Martha exclaimed, holding out a steaming casserole dish. "I make a mean chicken casserole, and it's tradition to bring one for newcomers." Elaine's face lit up. "Thank you so much. I'm Elaine Wilson, and this is my husband, Thomas." Martha squinted with curiosity. "So what brings you both here? A fresh start, perhaps?" Thomas nodded, glancing at Elaine. "You could say that. I work in public service, but we wanted a change from the city. Slower pace, friendlier neighbors, a little peace and quiet, you know." Martha seemed to hesitate, as though weighing her words carefully. "Well, Maplewood has its charm, that's for sure. But be careful about certain elements." She lowered her voice conspiratorially, glancing around. "There are a couple of officers here, Mitchell and Tanner. They're not the friendliest sorts. A lot of folks in town have had less than pleasant experiences with them." Thomas stiffened, though he kept his expression neutral. "Is that so? I hadn't heard anything." "Oh, you'll hear about it soon enough. Mrs. Robinson, she's a friend of mine. Her boy was hassled by them just last week. He was just reading a book in the park, and they claimed he looked suspicious. She's hardly the only one, either." Elaine's stomach turned uneasily, but she forced a polite smile. "Thank you for the heads up, Martha. It sounds like there are some things we'll need to be aware of." After Martha left, Thomas and Elaine sat in silence for a moment, the excitement of moving tempered by an unsettling reality. Elaine felt a wave of anger surge within her. "It's not right, Thomas. Someone needs to stand up to them," she said, her voice firm. "Believe me, I'll be handling it soon enough," Thomas replied, though he kept the details vague. "But for now, let's keep a low profile. I need to observe and get a sense of what's really going on here." Over the next few days, the Wilsons continued settling into their new home. They met a few more neighbors, many of whom were warm and welcoming. But they also noticed the odd, subtle glances that some residents cast their way. Elaine caught herself feeling self-conscious whenever she saw a police car pass by. Once, she even noticed an officer lingering at the end of the street, his gaze fixed on their house. It wasn't until a few days later, on a routine trip to the local grocery store, that Elaine got her first direct glimpse of the tensions Martha had warned them about. She was on her way out, carrying a bag of groceries, when she saw a black teenage boy standing outside the store, nervously clutching a book. Moments later, a police car pulled up, and two officers stepped out, one tall and lean, the other stocky with a rigid stance. It didn't take much to realize that these were the infamous officers Mitchell and Tanner. "Hey, kid," the taller officer called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "What are you up to, standing here all suspicious-like?" The boy's hands shook slightly, but he held his ground. "Just waiting for my mom, sir. She's inside, picking up some things." The stockier officer snorted. "Oh, so you're just hanging around outside a store. That sounds real innocent. Why don't you empty that backpack of yours, huh? Let's make sure you're not carrying anything you shouldn't be." Elaine's heart raced, anger boiling inside her. She wanted to step forward, to say something, but she remembered Martha's warning. Instead, she watched helplessly as the boy obediently unzipped his backpack, spilling out textbooks and notebooks onto the pavement. After a rough search that turned up nothing, the officers shrugged, smirking. "Get out of here," the taller one said, kicking the boy's book across the pavement. "And don't let us catch you hanging around again." The boy gathered his belongings quickly, his face burning with shame as he walked away. Elaine felt sick to her stomach. This wasn't just about one boy. It was about an entire community being made to feel like criminals in their own home. Later that evening, when she told Thomas what she'd seen, he nodded grimly. "They're testing their boundaries," he said, his voice steely. "But they don't know who's watching them now." Lines in the sand. The morning sun cast a warm glow over Maplewood's charming streets, and the sounds of lawnmowers and children laughing filled the air. For most of the residents, it was a typical weekend day. But for Elaine and Thomas Wilson, the shadows of their recent observations lingered. They had only been in Maplewood for a short while, yet they were starting to understand the deeper realities of this quiet town. Elaine tried to put the incident at the grocery store out of her mind. She wanted to believe it was an isolated event, but she'd heard enough from their neighbor Martha and witnessed enough herself to know better. For Thomas, who had witnessed police misconduct in his previous position, Maplewood was a case study in unchecked power. Each day, he noted more examples of subtle intimidation and abuse. But today, Elaine wanted to focus on something hopeful. She was starting her job as a teacher at Maplewood High next week, and she was determined to make a positive impact. Elaine spent the morning organizing her classroom, arranging desks, and decorating the bulletin boards with motivational quotes and colorful posters. She had a knack for creating an inviting environment, a place where students felt seen and valued. As she put the final touches on the room, she looked around, feeling a surge of pride. This was her sanctuary, her contribution to the town, a small yet meaningful way to make a difference. The first day of school arrived with a mixture of excitement and nerves. Elaine welcomed each student with a warm smile and made it her mission to learn all their names by the end of the week. Her classroom quickly became a safe haven, especially for the students who had felt the weight of Maplewood's quiet tensions. She encouraged open discussion, fostered curiosity, and most importantly, emphasized respect. But not everyone in town was as open to change. During her lunch break one day, Elaine sat in the teacher's lounge with some of her colleagues. As they chatted, she mentioned her excitement about a new reading program she was hoping to implement. One of the other teachers, a woman named Linda, who had been in Maplewood for over a decade, gave her a skeptical look. "You've got big ideas for someone new around here," Linda said, her voice laced with a hint of warning. "Maplewood isn't the kind of place that likes change, Elaine, especially not from outsiders." Elaine felt her cheeks flush. She hadn't expected such a cold reception, especially from a fellow teacher. "I just want to create a space where every student feels comfortable. I think that's important, don't you?" Linda shrugged, taking a sip of her coffee. "Comfort doesn't come easy for everyone here. You'll see what I mean soon enough." The words echoed in Elaine's mind long after she left the lounge. There was something about the way Linda had said it, as though she knew something Elaine didn't. But Elaine shook it off. She wasn't here to maintain the status quo. She was here to make a difference, no matter how small. That evening, as Elaine was walking home, she noticed a group of students gathered near the town square. Curious, she approached, recognizing Marcus, one of her students, at the center of the group. His face was tense, and he was speaking in hushed tones to a few other black teenagers. As Elaine got closer, she overheard snippets of their conversation. "They stopped me again," Marcus was saying, frustration evident in his voice. "Just because I was walking home from school. Officer Tanner said I looked suspicious. I was just walking." The other students murmured their own grievances, nodding in agreement. Elaine cleared her throat, and the group looked up, startled. "Ms. Wilson," Marcus said, his face a mixture of relief and embarrassment. "Is everything okay, Marcus?" Elaine asked gently. Marcus hesitated, looking down at the ground. "It's just those officers. They keep stopping us. They say we look suspicious or that we're causing trouble, but we're just living our lives, you know." Elaine's heart ached as she saw the pain in his eyes. These kids were too young to carry such burdens, yet they were already learning to navigate a world that treated them with suspicion simply because of their skin color. "Listen, Marcus," she said softly, "you're doing nothing wrong. And if you ever feel unsafe or need someone to talk to, you know where to find me. This town has a lot to learn, but people like you and me, we can help them see the truth." Marcus gave a small nod, a glimmer of hope in his expression. Later that night, Elaine shared the encounter with Thomas. He listened intently, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he took a deep breath. "This isn't just a bad habit, Elaine. This is a pattern. And the worst part is, they think they're untouchable." Elaine looked at him, sensing the tension behind his calm demeanor. "What do you mean?" "Mitchell and Tanner," Thomas said, leaning forward. "They're the kind of officers who rely on fear to control people. They do things just within the bounds of the law, but they cross ethical lines every chance they get. And the department, it seems like they've been letting it slide." He hesitated, clearly struggling with the next part. "And I think the town council knows about it. That's why they asked me to stay quiet until the official announcement next month. They're worried that if word gets out about my position as the new police chief, it'll cause a backlash before I have a chance to make real changes." Elaine's eyes widened. "So they want you to watch everything that's happening here before you take over?" "Exactly," Thomas replied. "And I have to play along, at least for now. I need evidence, documentation of the abuses. If I confront them too soon, they'll just deny it and close ranks. But every day, I'm watching, taking notes, building a case." Elaine reached out, placing her hand over his. "We're in this together, Thomas. I'll do whatever it takes to help." The next day, Elaine made a small yet bold decision. During her English class, she introduced a unit on civil rights literature, selecting works by authors like James Baldwin, Maya Angelou, and Langston Hughes. The students were initially surprised, but as they read excerpts and discussed the texts, Elaine saw them start to open up. The unit sparked curiosity, questions, and even some debates among the students. Marcus, who had been quiet in her class since the first day, raised his hand during a discussion on Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. "Ms. Wilson," he said, his voice steady, but filled with an intensity that caught everyone's attention. "Why do you think some people are afraid of others just because of their skin color?" Elaine paused, choosing her words carefully. "Fear often comes from ignorance, Marcus. And sometimes people in power use that fear to keep others in line. But writers like Baldwin, they challenge us to see beyond fear, to understand each other. That's how change starts, by asking questions and seeing the humanity in each other." The classroom fell into a contemplative silence, and Elaine felt a surge of pride. She had given them something real to think about, something that reached beyond textbooks and tests. Little did she know, the effects of her lesson would ripple beyond the classroom in ways she hadn't anticipated. That evening, as she walked home, She noticed two patrol cars parked at the end of her street. Officers Mitchell and Tanner were leaning against one of the cars, their eyes fixed on her as she approached. Their expressions were unreadable, but their gaze was steady, almost challenging. "Good evening, officers," Elaine said, her voice calm but firm. Mitchell smirked, crossing his arms. "Ms. Wilson, right? The new teacher in town. You've been making quite an impression on some of the local kids." Elaine forced herself to maintain eye contact. "My job is to teach, Officer Mitchell. I don't see anything wrong with that." "Oh, I don't either," he replied, a note of sarcasm in his voice. "But maybe you should stick to teaching grammar and leave the big ideas to people who actually understand them." Elaine's jaw tightened, but she remained composed. "If you'll excuse me, I have things to do. Good night." As she walked past them, she could feel their eyes on her back. The encounter left her shaken, but she knew better than to show it. She also knew she couldn't share this with Thomas just yet. He was under enough pressure as it was, and she didn't want to add to it. But as Elaine closed the door behind her, she realized that she'd just crossed an unspoken line. Maplewood wasn't just a town with a few bad apples. It was a place where fear was woven into the fabric of daily life, and anyone who dared to pull at those threads risked becoming a target. That night, as she lay in bed, Elaine stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions. How far would these officers go to maintain control? And how much longer could she and Thomas keep their intentions under wraps before things spiraled out of control? For now, they would keep gathering evidence, observing, and preparing. But Elaine knew that it was only a matter of time before the quiet resistance brewing in Maplewood would reach a breaking point. Boundaries and breaking points. For Elaine and Thomas Wilson, the following weeks felt like walking a tightrope. Each day they balanced their roles in the town, keeping their heads down yet silently observing every injustice they encountered. Thomas kept careful notes, documenting every encounter, every slight, every moment of cruelty that Mitchell and Tanner inflicted on the town's black residents. In Elaine's classroom, she cultivated an environment of acceptance and resilience, urging her students to think critically and empathize with one another. But each passing day, the thin veneer of civility in Maplewood began to crack, exposing the entrenched prejudice lurking beneath its idyllic facade. One afternoon, Elaine received a call from Marcus's mother, Diane Robinson. Diane was a warm, resilient woman who had grown up in Maplewood and had seen firsthand how the town had changed. Since officers Mitchell and Tanner joined the force, Maplewood had become less a safe haven and more a place of silent tension. When Elaine answered the call, Diane's voice was trembling. "Ms. Wilson, I didn't know who else to call," Diane said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's Marcus. He just got home, and he's shaken. Those officers, Mitchell and Tanner, they stopped him again. This time they made him take off his shoes, his jacket, and empty every pocket right there in front of everyone." Elaine's heart sank, and her grip tightened on her phone. "Diane, I'm so sorry. Are you and Marcus safe right now?" "Yes, we're safe," Diane replied, her voice filled with frustration and a hint of helplessness. "But I'm scared, Ms. Wilson. What if next time they decide that humiliating him isn't enough? What if they take him in, or worse?" Elaine swallowed hard. She knew she had to choose her words carefully. "I know this is difficult, Diane, but you're not alone. I'm here for you, and so is Thomas. We're working on ways to make sure this doesn't happen again. We're gathering evidence and building a case, but we need time. If you can be patient, I promise we're doing everything we can." "Thank you," Diane whispered, a faint glimmer of hope in her tone. "Thank you for caring." After hanging up, Elaine paced the kitchen, her mind racing. She wanted to share everything with Thomas, but she knew he was out meeting with members of the town council. The meeting was ostensibly about his upcoming role as chief, but Thomas suspected that the council wanted to control the narrative, to ensure that any changes he implemented wouldn't disrupt Maplewood's image. When Thomas returned home that evening, Elaine recounted her conversation with Diane. His face hardened with each word, his jaw clenched in barely restrained anger. "They're escalating," he said, his voice low and steady. "They know the town's black residents are scared, and they're feeding off it." Elaine touched his arm, trying to soothe the fire in his eyes. "What can we do, Thomas? We can't wait much longer. People are getting hurt." Thomas took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've been compiling statements from the few residents who are willing to speak up, but a lot of people are too scared, even with me as a supposed ally within the system. The council wants to keep things quiet until I'm officially in office. They think they're giving me time to learn the ropes. But in reality, they're just stalling, hoping this all blows over." Elaine nodded, absorbing his frustration. "Then let's take matters into our own hands. If we can't go through the council, maybe we go around them." Thomas raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Elaine paused, weighing her next words. "A town meeting. Not an official one, but something organized by the community. We could invite people who've been affected, give them a safe place to share their stories. If we can document everything, we'll have the leverage we need to demand accountability." Thomas considered her plan. "It's risky. If Mitchell and Tanner catch wind of it, they'll try to intimidate people into staying quiet. But it might be the only way." Over the next week, Elaine quietly spread word of the meeting among her students' parents and other community members. She was careful, discreet, and selective, inviting only those she trusted. Word spread quickly, and soon, people were whispering about the gathering. Some were cautious, afraid of the consequences, but others were eager to finally be heard. On the night of the meeting, Elaine and Thomas arrived at the Maplewood Community Center to find a crowd already gathering. Parents, students, elderly residents, and young families filled the room, their faces a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Marcus and his mother, Diane, were among the first to arrive, and Diane gave Elaine a grateful nod as they entered. As the room filled, Elaine stepped to the front, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. This wasn't just a meeting. It was a stand against a system that had kept people in fear for far too long. "Thank you all for coming," Elaine began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I know this isn't easy. Speaking out takes courage, and I want you to know that Thomas and I are here to listen and support you. This town has a reputation for being safe and welcoming, but we all know that's not the full story." She paused, giving everyone a moment to absorb her words. "We're here tonight because there are people in power who are abusing their authority. People who have made some of us feel like strangers in our own home. But I believe that together, we can change that." Diane was the first to stand up, clutching her son's hand. Her voice was shaky at first, but as she spoke, a quiet strength emerged. "My son, Marcus, has been stopped by officers Mitchell and Tanner more times than I can count," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "He's just a kid. He likes to read, to play basketball, to hang out with his friends. But every time he steps outside, he's treated like a criminal. They've searched him, humiliated him, and made him feel like he doesn't belong." Diane's words struck a chord, and soon, others began to share their stories. One by one, residents stood up, recounting their encounters with the officers. Each story was unique, yet they all shared the same underlying theme: fear, humiliation, and a feeling of helplessness. Thomas took notes, recording every account with meticulous care. Each story added weight to the growing mountain of evidence against Mitchell and Tanner. Just as the last resident finished speaking, the door to the community center swung open. The room fell silent as officers Mitchell and Tanner stepped inside, their expressions a mix of anger and smug satisfaction. "Evening, folks," Mitchell said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I hear there's a little gathering happening here. Mind if we join?" The tension in the room was palpable. Thomas stepped forward, his face calm but his posture unyielding. "This is a private meeting, officers," he said firmly. Unless you have official business here, I'd ask that you leave. Tanner sneered. Official business? You know, Wilson, I've heard some interesting things about you and your wife. Seems like you two have been stirring up a bit of trouble. Elaine clenched her fists, fighting the urge to respond. But Thomas remained composed, meeting their gaze without flinching. We're just listening to the people in this community, Thomas replied. Something I'd suggest you try sometime. Mitchell's face twisted with barely contained anger. Watch yourself, Wilson. You may be new here, but we've been around long enough to know how things work. Maplewood isn't a town for troublemakers. The crowd bristled, and a few murmurs of dissent rippled through the room. Elaine stepped forward, her voice steady and resolute. Respecting the people you're sworn to protect isn't troublemaking, Officer Mitchell. It's common decency. The officers exchanged a look, their expressions darkening. But before they could respond, a voice from the crowd spoke up. You've been terrorizing this town for years, shouted an older man, his face lined with anger and pain. We're done living in fear. We're done staying silent. The room erupted in applause and shouts of agreement. Mitchell and Tanner looked around, clearly unprepared for the strength of the community's response. For the first time, they seemed to realize they were outnumbered, and that the tide was beginning to turn. After a tense moment, the officers retreated, leaving the room in silence. But as the door closed behind them, a palpable sense of victory filled the air. Elaine turned to the crowd, her voice steady. This is just the beginning. Tonight, we've taken a stand, but there's more work to be done. Thomas and I will continue gathering evidence, and we'll keep fighting for justice. We won't stop until everyone in this town feels safe. The crowd erupted into applause, and one by one, people approached Elaine and Thomas, offering their support and their stories. The community had found its voice, and together, they were determined to bring change to Maplewood. As they drove home that night, Elaine looked over at Thomas, a sense of quiet triumph settling over her. We did it, she whispered. We finally gave them a reason to hope. Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Yes, but we have to be ready for whatever comes next. Mitchell and Tanner aren't going to back down easily. This is just the beginning of a fight that could change everything. Elaine reached for his hand, feeling the weight of their mission settle between them. They had started something irreversible, something powerful. And no matter what came next, they were ready to face it together. The backlash. The days following the town meeting felt like the calm before a storm. While the community had taken a stand, a wave of retaliation from Officers Mitchell and Tanner loomed over Maplewood. The officers, notorious for their ruthless tactics, now had a clear target on Elaine and Thomas Wilson. Elaine noticed the first signs of backlash on her way to work the following Monday. As she drove past the local park, she saw a police cruiser parked conspicuously at the entrance, and standing beside it were Mitchell and Tanner. Their eyes followed her car as she passed, their expressions smug and unyielding. She knew they were sending a message, a reminder that they still held power, at least for now. At Maplewood High, Elaine found herself constantly looking over her shoulder. During lunch, she overheard two of her white colleagues whispering in the teacher's lounge, their voices laced with a mix of fear and disapproval. She's only been here a few months, and already she's causing all this trouble, one of them said, casting a quick glance in Elaine's direction. Do you think she realizes what she's doing? Mitchell and Tanner don't mess around. People who've lived here their whole lives know better than to cross them, the other replied, shaking her head. Elaine kept her gaze focused on her lunch, pretending not to hear. But inside, she felt a pang of isolation. She had grown up believing that standing up for justice was the right thing to do, that teachers were meant to set an example for their students. Yet here she was, surrounded by adults who had let fear and complacency control them. The realization only fueled her resolve. As the week went on, more subtle forms of intimidation began to emerge. A letter arrived at the Wilsons' home, unsigned, with the words, "Mind your own business or else." Elaine held the note in her trembling hands, feeling a chill run down her spine. That evening, she showed it to Thomas, who took the note with an expression of steely calm. "They're getting desperate," he said, his voice steady. "The more we push back, the more they'll try to scare us into submission." Elaine's voice was barely a whisper. "I'm not afraid of them. I worry about the people who don't have anyone to protect them. People like Marcus and his mom." Thomas nodded, his jaw clenched. "We're doing this for them, Elaine. For everyone who's been too scared to speak up. They're counting on us." The following day, Diane Robinson called Elaine again, her voice filled with concern. "Marcus was stopped on his way home from school today," she said. "This time, they searched his entire backpack and made him stand there while they went through everything in front of his friends. He was humiliated, Ms. Wilson. He came home in tears." Elaine's heart ached, and her voice softened. "I'm so sorry, Diane. Please tell Marcus to hang in there. I promise, things will get better." Diane's voice cracked with frustration. "I want to believe you, Ms. Wilson, but it feels like every time we push back, they push back harder." After hanging up, Elaine took a deep breath and dialed Thomas. When he answered, she recounted Diane's story, her voice filled with both anger and sadness. "It's escalating, Thomas. They're targeting these kids, humiliating them in public, making them feel like criminals. I can't just sit by and watch this happen." Thomas sighed, a mixture of weariness and determination in his tone. "We're reaching the tipping point. If we're going to make a move, it has to be now." That evening, Elaine and Thomas invited a group of community leaders and trusted allies to their home. Diane Robinson, Marcus's mother, was among them, along with Mrs. Jenkins, the town clerk who had quietly expressed her support for their efforts. Together, they brainstormed strategies for bringing attention to the abuses in Maplewood without putting the community at further risk. "We need to go public," Mrs. Jenkins said firmly. "Social media, local news, anything to get people talking. The town council might ignore our complaints, but they can't ignore a public outcry." "But won't that put us at even more risk?" Diane asked, her voice filled with anxiety. Thomas looked at her with understanding. "It's true that going public could make things harder for us. But the only way to protect Marcus and everyone else is to expose these officers for what they truly are. If enough people see what's happening, they won't be able to hide anymore." Over the next few days, Elaine and Thomas worked tirelessly to gather testimonies from the community, compiling accounts from residents who had experienced harassment, discrimination, and abuse at the hands of Mitchell and Tanner. Mrs. Jenkins, who had access to town records, discreetly provided copies of the complaints that had been filed against the officers over the years, complaints that had mysteriously disappeared from official records, but now found new life in the hands of the Wilsons. Once they had a solid collection of evidence, Elaine and Thomas reached out to local news stations, sharing their story and the stories of those who had suffered in silence. They knew the risks, knew that going public would put them in the crosshairs of those who wanted to keep Maplewood's dirty secrets hidden. But they also knew that this was the only way to bring about real change. The story spread quickly, the headlines blaring across social media and news outlets. "Police abuse in Maplewood. A town's silent suffering finally speaks out." Local and regional news stations picked up the story, airing clips of Elaine and Thomas standing side by side, speaking out against the injustices that had plagued their town. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from nearby towns and cities, with people offering their encouragement and even sharing their own experiences with police abuse. But there was also backlash. Anonymous calls flooded their home phone, filled with hateful words and thinly veiled threats. Someone even spray-painted traitors on their front fence, a crude reminder that not everyone supported their fight. But Elaine and Thomas refused to be intimidated. They knew they were making a difference, and each new act of intimidation only strengthened their resolve. They had the support of the community now, and that support was growing with each passing day. Meanwhile, the town council was forced to confront the growing unrest in Maplewood. The mayor, who had previously avoided addressing the issue, finally agreed to a meeting with Thomas to discuss the situation. When Thomas arrived at Town Hall, he was met by a council that looked distinctly uncomfortable. The mayor cleared his throat, attempting to sound authoritative. "Mr. Wilson, I'm sure you understand the position you've put us in. Maplewood has a reputation to uphold, and this publicity isn't helping." Thomas raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but firm. "The publicity isn't the issue, Mayor. The problem is that 2 of your officers have been abusing their power, and the people of this town have been suffering because of it. Maplewood's reputation was already tarnished. It's only now that people are seeing the truth." The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "Well, we can't have officers harassing citizens, of course, but we also can't have accusations flying around without proof. It undermines trust in law enforcement." Thomas leaned forward, his gaze steady. "The proof is in the complaints that have been filed for years, complaints that you and this council have ignored. The people of this town are demanding change, and as the incoming chief, it's my job to ensure that change happens." The room fell silent, and the council members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, the mayor nodded reluctantly. "Very well. We'll look into the matter, but I must remind you, Mr. Wilson, that this is still a delicate situation. We expect you to handle it with discretion." Thomas gave a curt nod, though he could see the reluctance in their eyes. They were still clinging to the status quo, but he knew that the tide had already begun to turn. When he returned home that evening, Elaine greeted him at the door, her expression filled with anticipation. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice a mix of hope and apprehension. "They're starting to crack," Thomas replied. "They're still trying to save face, but they know they can't ignore this anymore." Elaine's eyes sparkled with a fierce determination. "Then we keep pushing. We keep the pressure on until they have no choice but to do what's right." Over the next few weeks, the community's outcry grew louder. Petitions circulated, demanding accountability for Officers Mitchell and Tanner. A group of parents formed a coalition, calling for police reform and safer neighborhoods for their children. The media continued to cover the story, keeping the spotlight on Maplewood and ensuring that the council couldn't simply brush the issue under the rug. Finally, the council announced a public meeting to address the community's concerns. Word spread quickly, and on the day of the meeting, the town hall was packed with residents, many of whom had come to support Elaine, Thomas, and the other voices that had spoken out. Elaine sat in the front row, her heart pounding as she looked around at the crowd. Diane was there, her hand resting protectively on Marcus's shoulder. Mrs. Jenkins stood nearby, a quiet symbol of solidarity. And Thomas sat beside Elaine, his face calm but his eyes filled with determination. The mayor took the stage, his face tight with tension as he addressed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, I understand that there have been concerns raised about our law enforcement practices. I want to assure you that the town council takes these concerns very seriously. We are committed to conducting a thorough investigation and ensuring that Maplewood remains a safe and welcoming community for all." The words sounded hollow, and Elaine could feel the crowd's frustration simmering. But before anyone could voice their dissent, a figure stepped forward from the back of the room. It was Officer Tanner, his face twisted with anger. "This is ridiculous," he sneered, his voice cutting through the crowd. "These so-called complaints are nothing but lies. The Wilsons come here, stirring up trouble, and suddenly everyone's got a problem with the police." The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Elaine and Thomas. Thomas stood up, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "Officer Tanner, this isn't about stirring up trouble. This is about accountability. It's about ensuring that every citizen of Maplewood, no matter their background, is treated with respect." Tanner sneered, his eyes narrowing. "Respect? You come here, acting like you're above us, like you're here to save the town. But you don't know this place. You don't know what it takes to keep order." Elaine stood beside Thomas, her voice clear and unwavering. "Keeping order doesn't mean trampling on people's rights, Officer Tanner. It doesn't mean treating our children like criminals." The crowd erupted in applause, their voices rising in support of Elaine and Thomas. The council members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that they had lost control of the narrative. The people of Maplewood were no longer afraid, and the council had no choice but to listen. In the weeks that followed, Mitchell and Tanner were placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. A task force was created to review the town's police practices, and new guidelines were put in place to ensure greater accountability and transparency. The change was slow, but it was real, and it was a victory hard won by a community that had finally found its voice. As Elaine and Thomas walked through the town square one evening, hand in hand, they looked around at the people they had come to know. The neighbors who had once been afraid to speak out, the families who had found strength in unity. They had come to Maplewood for a fresh start, but they had found something much more meaningful, a community united in purpose, a town transformed by courage and resilience. And as the sun set over Maplewood, casting a warm glow over the streets, Elaine and Thomas knew that this was only the beginning of a journey toward justice and hope. The reckoning. The investigation into Officers Mitchell and Tanner gained momentum quickly. The local district attorney, compelled by the mounting public pressure and the extensive evidence compiled by Thomas, opened a formal inquiry into their conduct. The town's atmosphere was charged with anticipation, and whispers of change buzzed through Maplewood's quiet streets. Elaine and Thomas's house became an informal gathering point for the community. Neighbors would stop by to offer words of encouragement, drop off notes of gratitude, and share their own stories of resilience and hope. Marcus and his mother, Diane, visited frequently, often staying late into the evening to discuss how they could continue supporting the cause. One afternoon, just as Elaine was finishing a lesson on Maya Angelou's "I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings," she received a call from an unexpected number. When she answered, the voice on the other end was that of Sarah Collins, a young reporter who had been following the story closely. Sarah was a rising star at a regional news station and had grown captivated by Maplewood's battle for justice. "Ms. Wilson, I'd like to do a feature on you and your husband," Sarah said, her voice filled with sincerity. "I think your story could resonate with so many people who faced similar challenges in their own communities." Elaine hesitated, glancing at the door as her students filed out. "I'm not sure. Thomas and I didn't do this for attention." "I understand," Sarah replied gently, "but I think your story goes beyond Maplewood. What you're doing is inspiring people. You've shown that even a small town can stand up to injustice. If you're willing to speak with me, I believe it could give hope to others who are struggling in silence." Elaine promised to consider it, her mind racing. She felt the weight of their story, but the idea of sharing it beyond Maplewood made her uneasy. Yet she knew that giving others hope might be worth stepping out of her comfort zone. When she discussed it with Thomas that evening, he listened thoughtfully before nodding. "This isn't just our story anymore, Elaine. It belongs to everyone who stood beside us. If we can reach even more people, then maybe it's worth it." The following week, Sarah Collins arrived in Maplewood, her camera crew in tow. She interviewed Elaine in her classroom, surrounded by books and posters that reflected her passion for teaching and justice. Elaine spoke about the challenges they'd faced, the strength of the community, and the hope she held for the future. But when Sarah asked about the personal sacrifices they'd made, Elaine hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "It hasn't been easy," she admitted. "There are days when I wonder if we've done the right thing, if the risks were worth it. But every time I see the kids in my class, or the parents who have found the courage to speak out, I know that this fight isn't just about us. It's about giving people a voice, about making sure that no one has to live in fear." The interview aired that evening, reaching audiences across the region. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people who had faced similar injustices, each one sharing words of encouragement and gratitude. The Wilsons found themselves at the center of a growing movement, their actions inspiring others to stand up in their own communities. Meanwhile, the investigation continued to uncover more damning evidence against Mitchell and Tanner. The district attorney's office compiled reports of harassment, discrimination, and abuse of power spanning years. As each new detail emerged, the town's residents grew more vocal, demanding accountability and calling for structural reforms within the police department. But not everyone in Maplewood supported the Wilsons' fight. While some neighbors had rallied around them, others were growing increasingly resentful. Anonymous letters began appearing in their mailbox, filled with accusations and threats. Some called them outsiders who didn't understand the town's traditions, while others accused them of trying to destroy the community's reputation. The once quiet streets now bore signs of division, as townspeople debated in hushed voices whether the Wilsons were heroes or troublemakers. One evening, just as Thomas was locking up the house, he noticed a figure lingering near the edge of their yard. When he stepped outside, he recognized Officer Mitchell. Leaning casually against a lamppost, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "Evening, Wilson," Mitchell drawled, his voice cold and mocking. "Seems like you're making quite a name for yourself around here." Thomas kept his composure, meeting Mitchell's gaze without flinching. "The investigation is out of my hands now, Mitchell. I suggest you take this time to reflect on your actions." Mitchell chuckled, his expression darkening. "You think you're untouchable now, don't you? But let me tell you something. You and your wife might be the darlings of the press, but that won't save you from what's coming. This town has a way of dealing with people like you." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he refused to give Mitchell the satisfaction of a reaction. "If you're here to threaten me, I suggest you leave. This town isn't yours to control anymore." Mitchell's eyes flashed with anger, but he gave a mocking salute and disappeared into the night. Thomas watched him go, feeling the weight of the unspoken threat lingering in the air. He knew that Mitchell wouldn't go down quietly, and he worried about the lengths he might go to in order to protect his power. The next day, news broke that Mitchell and Tanner had both been officially suspended from duty, pending the outcome of the investigation. The town erupted in a mixture of celebration and unease. While many saw it as a long overdue step toward justice, others feared what might happen next. Mitchell and Tanner had friends in the department, officers who shared their mindset and who might retaliate. In response, the district attorney's office sent a team of state investigators to Maplewood, tasked with reviewing the town's police practices and implementing immediate reforms. For the first time in years, Maplewood was under scrutiny from outside authorities, and the town's residents felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. But the backlash against the Wilsons continued. One afternoon, as Elaine was grading papers in her classroom, a brick shattered her window, sending glass scattering across her desk. She jumped back, heart pounding, and rushed to the window, only to see a figure disappearing around the corner of the building. A hastily scrawled note attached to the brick read, "You've gone too far. Stop, or else." That evening, as Elaine and Thomas surveyed the damage, she felt a pang of fear unlike any she had felt before. But Thomas placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and steady. "They're scared, Elaine. They're lashing out because they know their time is running out. We're almost there." Elaine nodded, her determination renewed. "I know, and we're not stopping now." As the days passed, the town's support for the Wilsons continued to grow. Parents organized rallies outside the school, holding signs that read, "Justice for all," and "Accountability now." Students created posters and banners, decorating the school with messages of unity and resilience. Maplewood had transformed from a town of silent suffering to one of vocal resistance, and the Wilsons were at the heart of it all. The investigation finally culminated in a public hearing, held in the town square. The district attorney's office presented its findings, detailing the years of abuse and misconduct perpetrated by Mitchell, Tanner, and a small circle of officers who had turned a blind eye. The crowd listened in stunned silence, their faces a mixture of anger and disbelief as the full extent of the corruption was revealed. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he stood before the crowd, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I came to Maplewood hoping for a fresh start, he began, his gaze sweeping over the faces of the townspeople. But what I found was a community suffering in silence, people who had been denied their rights and treated with suspicion and cruelty. No one deserves to live in fear. No one deserves to be made to feel like they don't belong. Today, we are here to say enough. Enough to the abuse, enough to the fear, enough to the silence. The crowd erupted into applause, their voices rising in support. Elaine watched from the front row, her heart swelling with pride. They had come so far, and she knew that Maplewood would never be the same. At the end of the hearing, the district attorney announced that Mitchell and Tanner would face charges of misconduct, harassment, and abuse of power. They were immediately taken into custody, and the crowd watched as the two officers were led away, their faces twisted with anger and humiliation. It was a moment of vindication, a symbol of the justice the town had fought so hard to achieve. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Maplewood became more visible. The police department underwent a complete overhaul, with new officers brought in to replace those who had been complicit in the abuse. Community policing programs were introduced, aimed at building trust and transparency between the department and the residents. A civilian oversight board was established, ensuring that the voices of the community would never again be silenced. Elaine and Thomas became local heroes, their story a beacon of hope for other towns facing similar challenges. Reporters from across the country visited Maplewood, eager to document the town's transformation. Elaine's classroom became a place of inspiration, her students looking up to her not just as a teacher, but as a symbol of courage and resilience. But amid the victory, Elaine and Thomas remained humble, grateful for the support of the community that had stood beside them. They knew that the fight for justice was ongoing, that there would always be work to do. But they also knew that Maplewood was now a town transformed, a place where people had learned to stand together, to speak out, and to demand better. One evening, as they walked through the town square, Elaine and Thomas paused in front of a new mural that had been painted on the side of a building. It depicted a young boy standing tall, his face filled with determination, surrounded by the words "strength and unity." It was a tribute to Marcus and to everyone who had found the courage to stand up for what was right. Elaine took Thomas's hand, a quiet smile on her lips. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Thomas squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed on the mural. "No, Elaine, we didn't do this. The town did. We just gave them a reason to believe." As they continued their walk, the sun setting over Maplewood, they knew that they had found more than just a new home. They had found a community, a purpose, and a legacy that would endure long after they were gone. A new dawn. A year had passed since the fateful public hearing that led to the arrest and conviction of officers Mitchell and Tanner. The streets of Maplewood looked the same as ever, but the atmosphere had changed in profound and beautiful ways. It was as if the entire town had exhaled after holding its breath for years, finally free to live without fear. The spirit of unity and strength lingered like a gentle breeze, touching every corner and every resident. Elaine and Thomas had become woven into the fabric of the community. Their house, once a quiet sanctuary on the edge of town, was now a well-known symbol of hope. Neighbors who had once eyed them with suspicion now visited frequently, dropping by to chat, share news, or even just say hello. Their yard, where the word "traitors" had once been scrawled in angry red paint, was now lush with flowers and trees planted by neighbors who wanted to show their appreciation. One bright morning, Elaine arrived at Maplewood High to find her classroom filled with homemade banners and cards. Her students, grinning from ear to ear, had filled her desk with notes of gratitude, each one scrawled in eager, youthful handwriting. "Thank you for teaching us how to stand up for what's right. You made us feel seen. I want to be brave like you, Mrs. Wilson." Tears filled Elaine's eyes as she read the notes, each one a testament to the impact she had made. She realized that she hadn't just taught her students English and literature. She had shown them how to use their voices, how to see each other, and how to believe in the power of their own actions. At the end of the day, Marcus approached her, his expression filled with the confidence he had once lacked. He was no longer the shy, cautious boy who had once been humiliated in front of his friends. He had become a young leader, respected and admired by his classmates. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, looking up at her with a smile, "I got accepted to the Youth Council." Elaine's heart swelled with pride. The Youth Council was a new initiative started by the town's Civilian Oversight Board to involve young people in shaping the community's future. It was a place where they could voice their concerns, share ideas, and work on projects that would benefit the town. "That's amazing, Marcus," she said, beaming. "I'm so proud of you." Marcus shrugged modestly, but couldn't hide his smile. "I just thought, if you can change things, maybe I can too." As he walked away, Elaine realized that Marcus wasn't the only one who had changed. The entire town was different, transformed by the collective courage and resilience of its residents. In the face of fear and intimidation, they had discovered their own strength, and they had used it to create a place where everyone felt they belonged. The town's police department had also undergone a transformation. Under Thomas's leadership, the officers had been retrained, with a focus on community engagement and transparency. The department now held weekly meetings where residents could voice their concerns directly to the officers. Thomas had introduced a ride-along program, allowing citizens to experience the officers' work firsthand and foster greater understanding between the department and the community. One afternoon, while he was at the station reviewing paperwork, Thomas received a visit from Captain Sarah Martinez, a trusted colleague who had been instrumental in helping to restructure the department. She had transferred from her previous department to join him, drawn by the challenge and the promise of building something new. "Chief Wilson," she said with a smile, taking a seat across from him, "you've done something remarkable here. I've never seen a community transform like this." Thomas leaned back in his chair, a modest smile playing at his lips. "It wasn't just me, Sarah. This town wanted change. They were ready for it. They just needed a reason to believe it was possible." Captain Martinez nodded, her expression thoughtful. "The department's in a good place now, thanks to you. Officers are building real relationships with the people they serve, and complaints of misconduct are down to almost nothing." "That's good to hear," Thomas replied, a sense of quiet pride settling over him. But Martinez's expression grew serious. "Still, you know there's always more work to be done. Change doesn't just happen once. It's something we have to keep working on, every day. People will look to you to make sure this department stays true to its mission, even when the spotlight fades." Thomas nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "I won't forget. We've come too far to go back now." That evening, Thomas and Elaine hosted a small gathering at their home to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the town's transformation. Friends, neighbors, students, and colleagues filled their yard, laughing and chatting as the sun set over Maplewood. Diane Robinson was there, her face radiant with joy as she watched Marcus play basketball with some of his friends. Mrs. Jenkins, the town clerk who had once whispered her frustrations quietly, now spoke openly, sharing stories of courage and resilience. As the night wore on, Elaine noticed Sarah Collins, the young reporter who had covered their story, standing near the edge of the yard, looking contemplative. "Sarah," Elaine greeted her warmly. "Thank you for coming." Sarah smiled, her eyes shining. "Thank you for inviting me. This town, it's something special. I've covered a lot of stories, but none of them felt quite like this." Elaine glanced around, watching as her neighbors laughed, hugged, and shared stories. "I think it's because Maplewood isn't just a place, it's a community, and we've all learned that we're stronger together." They stood in silence for a moment, both reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. "So, what's next for you and Thomas?" Sarah asked, a hint of curiosity in her voice. "Are you planning to stay here?" Elaine looked over at Thomas, who was deep in conversation with some of the new officers he had brought into the department. She knew that they had both considered moving on after everything they had been through, perhaps finding a quieter town where they could settle without drawing so much attention. But looking at the faces around her, she felt a surge of belonging that she hadn't felt in a long time. "I think we've found our place," she replied, her voice filled with certainty. "This is our home now, and we're not going anywhere." After the gathering had ended and the last guests had left, Elaine and Thomas sat on their porch, gazing out at the quiet streets. The stars shone brightly overhead, casting a gentle light over the town they had come to love. "It feels different, doesn't it?" Elaine murmured, resting her head on Thomas's shoulder. "Like the whole town has been reborn." Thomas nodded, his arm wrapped around her. "This is what we wanted, Elaine. A place where people look out for each other, where no one has to be afraid. We've come a long way." Elaine sighed contentedly, her heart filled with a sense of peace she hadn't felt since they had first arrived in Maplewood. She knew that their journey hadn't been easy, that the road to justice had been filled with challenges and sacrifices. But in the end, they had helped create something beautiful, something lasting. The following week, Maplewood held its annual Fall Festival, an event that had once been marked by subtle divides and unspoken tensions. But this year, it felt like a true celebration, a gathering of friends and neighbors who had learned to see each other with compassion and respect. Elaine watched as her students performed on stage, their faces bright with joy as they sang and danced. Marcus was among them, leading the group with confidence and pride. She thought back to the shy, quiet boy he had been when she first met him, and she felt a surge of pride at how far he had come. After the performance, Thomas joined her, his face beaming with pride as he watched the festivities unfold. "This is why we fought," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion. "This is what it was all for." Elaine nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek as she watched the people of Maplewood laugh, dance, and celebrate. They had transformed their pain into strength, their fear into unity. And now they had a town that reflected the best of who they were, a place of acceptance, courage, and hope. As the festival wound down, a group of young children approached Elaine, their eyes wide with excitement. "Mrs. Wilson," one of them asked, her voice filled with wonder, "can you tell us the story? The story about how you changed the town?" Elaine knelt down, smiling as she looked into their eager faces. "It wasn't just me," she said, her voice gentle. "It was all of us. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. It was about believing that we could be better, that we could be kind to each other and make this town a place where everyone feels safe and welcome." The children listened intently, their eyes wide with admiration. Elaine realized that this was the legacy they had built, a legacy of courage, of standing together, and of never giving up. As she and Thomas walked home that night, hand in hand, she felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. They had faced the darkness, stood up to injustice, and emerged stronger than ever. Maplewood was more than just a town now. It was a beacon of hope, a reminder that change was possible, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. Elaine and Thomas knew that their journey wasn't over, that there would always be new challenges to face and new battles to fight. But for now, they had a place to call home, a community that had become family, and a legacy that would live on long after they were gone. And as they walked through the quiet streets of Maplewood, with the stars shining brightly above, they knew that they had found something more precious than they had ever dreamed, a place where justice, kindness, and hope had finally found a home.